She found an abandoned World War II tank buried in her grandmother's scrapyard. Everyone said it was worthless junk, rusted beyond repair. But when her Belgian Malinois started whining and pawing frantically at a specific hatch, mechanic Zara Volkov realized this forgotten war machine was hiding a secret that would rewrite history and put her life in danger. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what's the most mysterious thing you've ever found in an old place. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling wasteland of metal that stretched across 35 acres outside the small town of Copper Falls. Zara Volkov wiped sweat and engine oil from her hands with a rag that had seen better decades as she surveyed the mechanical graveyard her grandmother, Katarina Volkov, had spent 60 years accumulating. At 31, Zara was the sole heir to this empire of rust and forgotten dreams, an inheritance that came with more debt than treasure. The town of Copper Falls, population 2,847, had opinions about the Volkov auto salvage yard. Some residents appreciated having a reliable source of vintage parts and restoration projects. Others viewed it as an environmental hazard that lowered property values and attracted unsavory characters. The mayor, William Hartwell, had made no secret of his desire to see the land developed into a shopping complex. He'd been circling like a vulture ever since Katarina's funeral 8 months ago, making increasingly aggressive offers that Zara had politely but firmly declined. Zara had grown up in grandmother Katarina's shadow, learning to tear down engines before she could properly tie her shoes. The old woman had emigrated from Eastern Europe in 1962, carrying nothing but a fierce work ethic and an uncanny ability to see potential in discarded machinery. She'd built the salvage business from a single pickup truck and a rented garage, eventually becoming the most trusted mechanic in 3 counties. But the back sections of the yard had always been off-limits to young Zara, declared too dangerous for children by a grandmother who feared nothing else in this world. Katarina had been secretive about her past, speaking English with a heavy accent that grew thicker when she was angry or excited. She'd claimed to be from Poland, though her stories never quite aligned with historical facts Zara later learned in school. The old woman had nightmares sometimes, waking the household with shouts in a language Zara couldn't identify. When pressed about her history, Katarina would simply say that some memories were better left buried, like the vehicles rusting in the desert sun. Now, facing mounting property taxes and pressure from creditors, Zara needed to catalog everything on the property. Her business partner and closest friend, Marcus Chun, had volunteered to help, but she'd insisted on doing the initial survey alone. Some things needed to be witnessed in solitude, especially when saying goodbye to a lifetime of memories. Her companion for this melancholy task was Ranger, a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois she'd rescued from a military dog training program that had deemed him too intelligent and independent for standard service. The dog possessed an unsettling ability to sense things before they happened, alerting Zara to mechanical failures hours before they occurred and visitors minutes before they arrived. Today, Ranger seemed unusually restless, padding nervously around the yard's perimeter as if tracking a scent only he could detect. The salvage yard was divided into sections based on vehicle type and era. The front areas, closest to the main road, held the most valuable inventory: classic muscle cars, vintage trucks, and collectible motorcycles that weekend enthusiasts browsed regularly. But the deeper you ventured into the maze of metal, the older and more mysterious the collection became. Katarina had acquired vehicles from military surplus auctions, government liquidations, and private estate sales, often paying premium prices for machines that seemed to have no practical value. Zara loaded her pickup truck with water, tools, camera equipment, and surveying materials as the morning temperature climbed toward triple digits. The back 40 acres hadn't been properly inventoried in decades, and she suspected her grandmother had been deliberately vague about their contents in insurance filings. As she drove the rutted dirt road that wound through towering stacks of stripped chassis and engine blocks, Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, ears twitching at sounds Zara couldn't hear. The landscape here felt almost post-apocalyptic. Desert vegetation had begun reclaiming the older sections, creating surreal sculptures where rusted metal and living plants intertwined. Barrel cacti grew through the empty windows of abandoned jeeps. Mesquite trees had split the chassis of trucks, their roots finding purchase in the smallest cracks. The silence was absolute except for the whisper of hot wine through hollow frames and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The morning's work revealed the true scope of Katarina's collecting obsession. Hidden beneath decades of sand and creosote bush were vehicles Zara had never seen before, machines whose origins were as mysterious as their purpose. A half-track personnel carrier with Cyrillic markings painted over with desert camouflage. An armored car bearing German insignia that had been carefully scratched away. A collection of motorcycles with modifications that suggested military use, though their specific function remained unclear. Each discovery raised more questions about her grandmother's past. How had a Polish immigrant acquired Soviet military vehicles? Why did so many of the machines show evidence of their original markings being deliberately obscured? And why had Katarina paid storage and property taxes on equipment that seemed to have no commercial value? Zara methodically photographed and cataloged each find, creating the detailed inventory that insurance adjusters and potential buyers would require. But as the morning wore on, she began to suspect that some of these vehicles might be more liability than asset. Several bore the distinctive angular design of Eastern European military equipment, and a few displayed partially visible serial numbers that might prove problematic if traced to their origins. The heat was becoming oppressive when she rounded a cluster of armored personnel carriers and stopped abruptly. There, nestled in a natural depression and almost completely hidden by 40 years of sand drift and desert vegetation, sat something that made her heart race. The profile was unmistakable despite its camouflaged condition, a genuine battle tank, massive and predatory even in its deteriorated state. This wasn't one of the light reconnaissance vehicles scattered throughout the yard, but a full-sized main battle tank, its long gun elevated at an aggressive angle and turret turned slightly to the right, as if tracking an invisible target. Sand had drifted against its tracks until only the upper portions remained visible, and Palo Verde trees had grown through gaps in its side armor. But even buried and forgotten, the machine radiated menace, like a sleeping dragon waiting to be awakened. Ranger jumped down from the truck and immediately began circling the tank, nose to the ground, tail rigid with concentration. His behavior was unlike anything Zara had seen before, not the playful curiosity he showed toward other vehicles, but an intense focus that bordered on obsession. He whined softly, a sound of frustration rather than distress, as if he'd found something important but couldn't communicate its significance. Zara approached the tank slowly, awed by its size and complexity. Even accounting for decades of weathering, the engineering was impressive. This was no mass-produced vehicle, but something crafted with precision and attention to detail. The armor plating showed sophisticated welding techniques, and what remained of the mechanical components suggested advanced metallurgy for its era. She began clearing sand and debris from around the tank's base, working methodically in whatever shade its bulk provided. The markings were too corroded to read clearly, but she could make out traces of military insignia and what appeared to be serial numbers stamped into the armor. The design was definitely European, though whether German, Soviet, or something else entirely remained unclear. As she worked, Ranger's agitation increased. He paced around the tank's perimeter, occasionally stopping to paw at specific points on the hull. His attention seemed particularly focused on the rear section, where a crew access hatch sat slightly ajar. The hatch's edges were crusted with decades of oxidation, but unlike the rest of the vehicle, it showed signs of having been opened recently, within the last few years rather than decades. The discovery that the hatch had been accessed recently sent a chill down Zara's spine despite the desert heat. Katarina had always claimed that her mobility issues prevented her from venturing into the back sections of the yard, yet someone had clearly been maintaining access to this particular vehicle. The implications were troubling. What had her grandmother been hiding out here? And why had she felt the need to keep it secret even from family? Ranger's behavior became increasingly urgent as Zara examined the hatch more closely. The dog whined and scratched at the metal, his claws producing an odd echo from within the tank's hull. The sound suggested the interior space was much larger than it should be, as if the tank's internal configuration had been substantially modified. Zara tried to lift the hatch manually, but decades of corrosion had partially seized the hinges. She returned to her truck for penetrating oil and a pry bar, working patiently to free the mechanism without causing damage. As she worked, she noticed other details that didn't belong on a standard military vehicle. The hatch itself was unusually thick, suggesting it had been designed to protect something more valuable than typical crew equipment. And the locking mechanism was far more sophisticated than necessary for a simple access panel. When the hatch finally gave way with a metallic groan that echoed across the desert, a rush of cool air escaped. Not the superheated atmosphere she'd expected from a metal box baking in the Arizona sun, but air that felt conditioned, preserved, almost refrigerated. The temperature differential was impossible given the tank's exposed position, yet undeniable. She shined her high-powered LED flashlight into the opening and froze. The beam revealed an interior that defied the laws of physics. Instead of the cramped crew compartment typical of tanks, the space below extended far beyond what the vehicle's external dimensions should have allowed. The walls were lined with metal shelving and storage compartments, all in remarkable condition despite the exterior's deterioration. But it was the contents of those compartments that made her hands tremble. Row upon row of metal containers, each bearing symbols that looked like warnings in multiple languages. Document tubes sealed with wax that had somehow remained intact despite decades of desert conditions. And in the center of it all, a steel briefcase sitting open as if someone had been interrupted while examining its contents. Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent, and unlike his normal vocalizations. He began pawing more frantically at the hatch rim, as if trying to prevent her from looking closer. But Zara was already leaning over the edge, flashlight beams sweeping across items that shouldn't exist in any abandoned military vehicle. The briefcase contained photographs and documents that made her blood freeze. Nazi eagle seals on official letterhead, technical drawings of weapons systems she didn't recognize, and photographs of people in 1940s clothing who looked disturbingly familiar. Faces she recognized from family photos her grandmother had kept hidden in a locked drawer. As Zara's flashlight beam moved deeper into the tank's impossible interior, she discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her family's history. Along the far wall, preserved behind climate-controlled glass panels, were dozens of artifacts that told a story her grandmother had never shared. SS officer uniforms bearing the same family name Katarina had abandoned when she came to America, experimental weapons blueprints stamped with her grandfather's signature, and photographs showing a much younger Katarina standing beside Nazi officials in what appeared to be a secret research facility. The tank wasn't just a piece of military surplus. It was a vault containing evidence of war crimes that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. And if the dates on those documents were accurate, her grandmother hadn't been a Polish refugee fleeing oppression. She'd been a Nazi scientist who'd escaped justice and spent 60 years hiding in plain sight. Ranger's frantic barking brought her back to the present moment, his instincts warning of danger she couldn't yet perceive. But as Zara stared at the evidence of her family's dark past, she realized that some secrets were buried for good reason. And now that she'd uncovered them, there would be people who would kill to keep them hidden. The Arizona sun had climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace, but Zara felt cold as she descended into the tank's impossible interior. Ranger whined anxiously above, his keen instincts warning of dangers she was only beginning to comprehend. The space defied physics, somehow extending far beyond the tank's external dimensions, with walls lined with preservation equipment that hummed quietly with electrical power. Someone had been maintaining this vault, and recently, her flashlight beams swept across row after row of carefully cataloged evidence. Metal filing cabinets labeled in German contained thousands of documents, research notes, personnel files, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic horror. Technical blueprints showed weapons designs she didn't recognize, marked with her grandfather's signature, Dr. Klaus Richter, Oberfuhrer SS. The man Katarina had claimed died fighting the Nazis had actually been one of their most valued scientists. In climate-controlled display cases, Zara found artifacts that made her stomach turn. Nazi regalia bearing the Richter family crest. Photographs of concentration camp experiments. Awards signed by Heinrich Himmler himself, commending Klaus Richter for his contributions to the advancement of the Reich. And in the center of it all, a leather journal written in Katarina's younger hand, documenting her role as Klaus's research assistant and eventual accomplice in his escape. The journal entries were methodical, cold, clinical. They described Katarina's work developing chemical weapons, her participation in human experiments, and her careful planning of Klaus's extraction from Germany as Allied forces closed in. But what chilled Zara most were the later entries, written after their arrival in America. Katarina hadn't fled in horror from her past. She'd been protecting it, preserving evidence of Nazi research that could still be valuable to the right buyers. Among the files, Zara discovered correspondence dating from the 1960s through the 2000s. Letters from South American contacts, Middle Eastern governments, and shadowy organizations willing to pay extraordinary sums for Nazi weapons technology. Katarina hadn't just been hiding her past, she'd been monetizing it, selling information that had funded her comfortable life in Copper Falls while financing continued research into chemical and biological weapons. A thick folder labeled Current Operations contained documents that made Zara's hands shake. Bank statements showing regular payments from organizations she recognized from news reports about international terrorism. Shipping manifests for chemical precursors sent to laboratories in countries with questionable human rights records. And most damning of all, recent correspondence discussing the sale of Klaus Richter's final project, a biological weapon so dangerous that even the Nazis had been afraid to deploy it. The final revelation came in a steel case marked with radiation symbols. Inside, nestled in protective foam, were dozens of vials containing what appeared to be preserved biological samples. The labels were in German, but the universal biohazard symbols were unmistakable. Katarina had been storing live cultures of weaponized pathogens in the Arizona desert for over 60 years, maintaining them with the same meticulous care she'd shown her vintage auto parts. As Zara photographed the evidence with trembling hands, she began to understand the true scope of her inheritance. This wasn't just a collection of Nazi memorabilia, it was an active biological weapons laboratory disguised as a salvage yard. And if the recent correspondence was accurate, Katarina had been planning one final sale before her death, a transaction that would put the world's most dangerous pathogens in the hands of the highest bidder. Emerging from the tank felt like surfacing from a nightmare. The desert heat hit her like a physical blow, but even the blazing sun couldn't warm the chill that had settled in her bones. Ranger immediately sensed her distress, pressing against her legs with the steady pressure that had helped her through panic attacks in the past. But this was beyond panic. This was the complete collapse of everything she believed about her family, her identity, and her place in the world. She sat in the truck's air conditioning for 20 minutes, staring at the digital camera that contained evidence of crimes against humanity. The smart thing would be to delete everything, seal the tank, and pretend she'd never found it. She could sell the salvage yard to Mayor Hartwell, move somewhere far away, and live in ignorant peace. But the journal entries made it clear that Katarina's network was still active, still waiting for the final delivery of Klaus Richter's biological weapons. The decision came when she found Katarina's cell phone hidden in the truck's glove compartment, protected by a password Zara cracked on the third try. Klaus 1943. The recent call history told a story of increasingly desperate negotiations. International numbers, coded conversations, and a final appointment scheduled for 3 days from now. 2 days after Katarina's unexpected death from what doctors had called a sudden heart attack. Someone was coming to Copper Falls to collect the biological weapons. And when they discovered that Katarina was dead and Zara knew about the vault, they would eliminate the only witness to their transaction. The evidence in her camera could expose a network of war criminals and terrorists, but only if she lived long enough to get it to the right authorities. Her first call was to Marcus Chun, her business partner, and the only person she trusted completely. She reached him at his automotive shop in Phoenix, speaking carefully in case the phone was monitored. "Marcus, I need you to come to the yard immediately. And bring your FBI contact, Agent Jennifer Torres. Tell her it's about international terrorism and biological weapons. Don't use the normal roads. Take the back trails and come armed." Marcus had known her long enough to recognize genuine fear in her voice. "Zara, what the hell did you find out there?" "Evidence that my grandmother was a Nazi war criminal who's been selling biological weapons to terrorists for 60 years. And they're coming to collect the final shipment in 2 days." The silence on the other end lasted so long she thought the call had dropped. Finally, Marcus spoke in the careful tone he used when defusing explosives during his army days. I'll be there in 3 hours. Don't touch anything else. Don't call anyone else. And don't let anyone onto the property. If someone shows up before I get there, run. Her second call was to the Copper Falls Sheriff's Department, though she suspected it might be compromised. Katarina had lived peacefully in the community for 60 years, which meant either the local authorities were incompetent or complicit. Sheriff Robert Caldwell listened to her story with obvious skepticism, promising to look into it, with the patronizing tone of a man humoring a hysterical woman. She hung up knowing that official channels would be useless. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, Zara made the most difficult decision of her life. She drove back to the tank, loaded her truck with as much evidence as she could safely transport, and began the process of destroying what remained. Using thermite charges from Marcus's demolition supplies, she systematically incinerated the biological samples, the weapons blueprints, and anything else that could be used to harm innocent people. The explosions echoed across the desert like thunder, sending pillars of smoke into the cloudless sky. Each detonation destroyed decades of Nazi research, while simultaneously announcing her location to anyone monitoring the area. She was burning bridges she could never rebuild, eliminating evidence that could have convicted war criminals, while also ensuring that their weapons would never be used again. By sunset, the tank was an empty shell, its secret compartments collapsed and its contents reduced to ash. Ranger sat beside her as she watched the smoke dissipate, his presence the only constant in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. She'd preserved enough evidence to expose the network, photographs, documents, and recorded testimony that would bring justice to those who deserved it. But she'd also made herself a target for people who killed to protect secrets far less damaging than what she now possessed. Marcus arrived as promised, accompanied by FBI agent Jennifer Torres and a full tactical team. The federal response was swift and comprehensive once they verified the evidence Zara had preserved. Within hours, the salvage yard was declared a federal crime scene, and Zara found herself in protective custody while agents traced Katarina's network across 3 continents. The investigation that followed made international headlines. Arizona grandmother was Nazi war criminal, dominated news cycles for weeks as authorities uncovered the full scope of the biological weapons conspiracy. Arrests were made in 12 countries, terrorist plots were disrupted, and decades of careful planning collapsed under the weight of federal scrutiny. Agent Torres explained the larger picture during one of many debriefings. Your grandmother wasn't just hiding from her past. She was the centerpiece of a network that's been operating since the end of World War II. Former Nazis, current terrorists, rogue scientists, and corrupt officials all working together to monetize the Reich's most dangerous research. By destroying those biological samples, you probably saved thousands of lives. The legal proceedings took months. Zara testified before Congress, international tribunals, and criminal courts, sharing the evidence that had been hidden in her family's salvage yard. The emotional toll was devastating. Learning that her beloved grandmother had been responsible for atrocities while simultaneously becoming the key witness in dismantling a global terrorism network. The salvage yard itself became evidence in the federal case, its contents cataloged and removed by hazmat teams. Mayor Hartwell's development plans were permanently shelved when the EPA declared the site contaminated and in need of extensive remediation. The irony wasn't lost on Zara. The land her grandmother had used to hide Nazi secrets would now be restored to its natural state, cleansed of the poison that had festered there for decades. The financial inheritance proved as complicated as the moral one. Assets were frozen, bank accounts were traced to their illegal sources, and everything connected to Katarina's weapons sales was seized by federal authorities. Zara found herself inheriting not wealth, but the responsibility of helping victims' families recover stolen Nazi gold that had funded the operation for decades. 6 months after the discovery, Zara stood in the same spot where she'd first found the tank, now marked only by a concrete pad and federal monitoring equipment. The desert was reclaiming the area, native plants beginning to grow where poisonous secrets had once festered. Ranger, now wearing a service dog vest marking him as an official federal witness protection companion, sat calmly beside her. Agent Torres had recommended witness protection and relocation, but Zara had chosen a different path. She'd sold her share of the automotive business to Marcus and used the proceeds to establish the Katarina Volkov Foundation, an organization dedicated to tracking down Nazi war criminals and supporting their victims' families. The foundation operated from a secure facility in Colorado, staffed by federal agents and international law enforcement experts. Her new life was dangerous but meaningful. Instead of inheriting guilt for her grandmother's crimes, she'd chosen to inherit responsibility for making amends. The biological weapons were destroyed, the terrorist network was dismantled, and the victims' families finally had resources to rebuild their lives. It wasn't the inheritance she'd expected, but it was the one she'd earned. The final irony came a year later, when renovations of the Foundation's headquarters uncovered another hidden cache. This one containing not weapons, but documentation of Allied prisoners her grandfather had secretly helped escape before fleeing Germany himself. Klaus Richter had been neither pure evil nor heroic good, but a complex man whose legacy contained both darkness and light. As Zara stood in the Colorado mountains, watching ranger chase butterflies through wildflower meadows, she reflected on the true lesson of her inheritance. Families pass down more than money and property. They pass down choices, consequences, and the opportunity for redemption. She couldn't change what Katarina had done, but she could choose what to do with the knowledge of those crimes. The rusted tank that everyone had dismissed as worthless junk had indeed contained secrets that changed everything. But perhaps the most important discovery wasn't what her grandmother had hidden, but what Zara had found within herself: the courage to confront evil, the strength to seek justice, and the wisdom to transform inherited darkness into a legacy of light. Sometimes the most worthless-looking inheritance contains the most valuable gift of all: the chance to choose who you want to become. If this story inspired you to think about your own family's legacy, share it with someone who might need to remember that we all have the power to write a better ending to our stories.